The planet Herzog's star was as barren as it was strange, its surface a patchwork of jagged mountains and endless, gray deserts, devoid of plant life or animals. But its skies, those skies were something else. Not blue, not a typical starry black, but a swirling, ever-changing sea of color, like liquid light poured out of the heavens. The air was thick with something alien, something beyond their understanding, but not so thick that it couldn't be breathed. At least, that was what they thought. "Here we are, folks." Herzog's star, Captain Eliza Grant muttered, her voice dry as the air outside, as the shuttle descended toward the rocky landscape. She stared out the window, her gaze fixed, but her mind elsewhere. For the last 6 months, they'd been settling in, studying, getting the colony up and running. But every step felt like walking on a tightrope strung between ambition and disaster. "Don't be such a pessimist, Eliza," said Tessa Lopez, who sat across from the captain, fiddling with her comms gear. "We got this. We have the best team. There's a ton of scientific potential here. You can practically feel the unknown in the air." "You feel the unknown in the air?" Eliza raised an eyebrow, but a faint smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Tessa, the colony's communications officer, was a walking encyclopedia of optimism, sometimes annoyingly so. "I feel it. And I'm starting to think maybe it feels us back," Tessa grinned, eyes twinkling. "Or maybe it's just the altitude." The shuttle's engines hummed a low, reassuring sound as they touched down, stirring up the dust of the barren land. The metal beneath their feet creaked, the door opening with a mechanical groan, and the first breath of Herzog's star's air, slightly metallic, slightly thick, filled their lungs. Dr. Simon Hale, the colony's xenobiologist, was the first to jump out, practically hopping off the shuttle like a dog ready to run. "Ah, yes. Herzog's star." He grinned like a child on Christmas morning. "It's perfect, isn't it? So alive. We're standing on a treasure trove of biology here." Tessa rolled her eyes. "You and your treasure hunts, Simon. Let's just hope whatever we find doesn't end up trying to eat us." Simon chuckled, adjusting his glasses. "You worry too much. There's nothing here, no plants, no animals, just empty rock." "But," he paused, his voice dropping to a whisper as he looked out over the desolate landscape. "But there's something. I can feel it. Something beneath the surface." Eliza glanced at him sharply. "Feel it? You're letting your imagination run wild. Keep your focus on what we know." "What we know," Simon muttered, "is that we found a completely unique world. No terrestrial life, not a single living thing other than those Kwei, those odd jellyfish-looking things we've seen floating in the sky." "Yeah, and they don't exactly like us," Tessa shot back, pointing to a nearby spire of rock that looked like a sharp tooth jutting from the ground. The planet had its own strange geometry, impossible to predict and impossible to ignore. A voice crackled through their earpieces. "This is Larkin, over at base. We've lost contact with the communication probe again. Any thoughts?" "Not again." Tessa groaned, glancing back at the shuttle's control panel where the failing signals flashed in frustration. "I swear, the only thing this planet hasn't managed to break is our spirits." Eliza's frown deepened. "We've had signal dropouts before. Just run diagnostics again." "Already did," Larkin replied. "Nothing's working. Something's blocking the signal. You might want to take a look, Captain." Eliza exchanged a look with Simon. "I'll handle it." "Simon, Tessa, you two keep your eyes open for anything strange. You know, more than usual." With a quick nod, Simon and Tessa set off, their voices mingling in the wind as they chatted, but their steps soon quieted. The planet felt unsettlingly empty. And that made it all the more eerie. The shuttle's engine whined as Eliza adjusted the throttle to glide closer to the central hub of the colony. When she arrived at the communications station, Larkin was already pacing around, a frustrated expression carved deep into his face. "What do you think?" Larkin asked without greeting her, gesturing to the unresponsive console. "I think it's weird." Again. Eliza leaned in, tapping a few buttons. The screen blinked erratically before cutting to static, a buzz of unintelligible noise filling the air. "Well, that's helpful," Eliza muttered sarcastically. She was about to speak when, suddenly, the screen cleared. A low, distorted voice hissed through the speakers. "Stop." Eliza froze, her hand hovering over the controls. "Did you hear that?" she asked, voice low. Larkin stared at the screen, his face pale. "Yes. Yes, I did." Another long pause, the static almost seeming to hum with its own intelligence. "Stop," the voice repeated, but this time, the tone had a deeper resonance, as if it was not merely a warning, but a command. "Who's transmitting that?" Eliza snapped, looking around the small room. "Nobody, Captain. There's nothing. I mean, it's coming from the surface." But before Larkin could finish his sentence, the transmission ended with a sharp pop of static, and the screen blinked back to its usual dead state. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Eliza stepped back, glancing at Larkin. "This planet. It's not just empty. It's trying to tell us something." Meanwhile, Simon and Tessa had wandered deeper into the alien landscape, following the unusual terrain. It was a stark world, no greenery, no trees, just strange formations of rock and dust, like the planet itself had never seen rain or change. "What if we're not the first ones to be here?" Simon mused aloud, his voice thoughtful. "What if the Kwei were here long before we arrived?" Tessa laughed. "What, you think they've been sitting around in their jellyfish cocoons waiting for humans to show up? Don't get me wrong, I'm all for making alien friends, but come on, Simon. They're jellyfish in the sky." "That's where you're wrong, Tessa. They may not be jellyfish. They may have a completely different biology, a completely different way of seeing the universe. The way they float, they might not even need oxygen to survive. What if we're seeing something that doesn't need to be seen in human terms?" Simon paced in circles, mind racing. Tessa's eyes narrowed as something strange caught her attention. "You hearing that?" she asked, her voice suddenly serious. The wind had died down, and for the first time, the planet felt still. A soft hum, almost imperceptible, echoed from beneath the ground. Simon stopped, his hand on his chin. "Yes. I hear it." The hum grew louder, reverberating through the air like some kind of deep resonance. It wasn't a noise, it was felt in the bones, in the gut. The ground seemed to shiver beneath their feet, and the sky overhead shimmered, as though the planet itself were reacting to their presence. Tessa felt her pulse quicken. "This is way too creepy for me," she muttered. "Let's just find the probe and get out of here." But as she turned to leave, something in the distance caught her eye. A massive shape loomed over the horizon, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. It was, floating the Kwei. Simon's eyes widened. "There they are." Suddenly, a surge of panic hit Tessa. Are they coming for us?" The Kwei floated just beyond the horizon, their ethereal, gelatinous bodies drifting in the air like translucent jellyfish, their form shimmering in the strange light of Herzog's star's ever-shifting sky. Simon stood frozen for a moment, his breath shallow as he stared at the alien creatures. His mind buzzed, processing the impossibility of what he was seeing. Tessa's heart pounded. "Are they coming for us?" "I don't think they're hostile," Simon said, his voice more thoughtful than reassuring. "They seem..." He cut himself off, squinting into the distance, trying to make sense of their movement. The Kwei weren't moving toward them, exactly. They seemed to be circling, weaving through the thick air like sentient balloons, their bodies rippling and undulating as they moved in synchrony. It was unsettling in the way something so perfectly alien could be. Their skin shifted color, pulsating gently in waves, as if reacting to an unseen force. Tessa's fingers tightened around her comm device. We should report this back. But I think we need to move. I don't know what they want, but I don't trust that, whatever it is. Before Simon could respond, the deep, vibrating resonance they'd felt earlier suddenly became louder, much louder. The air itself seemed to thrum with the sound, a strange, almost hypnotic frequency that seemed to resonate in the bones. It was like the planet itself was speaking, and whatever it was saying, it wasn't a language they could understand. Simon began, but then something unexpected happened. The ground beneath their feet rumbled. It wasn't a small tremor. It felt like a full-on shift, a deep groan of the planet as if something massive were moving under the surface. Simon! Tessa shouted, grabbing his arm as the ground buckled again, sending them both stumbling forward. They hit the dirt just as the Kwei suddenly surged toward them, their forms flashing across the sky with unnatural speed. The whole world seemed to tremble with their movement. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the Kwei halted. Suspended in the air, they formed a perfect circle around the two humans, their long, glowing tendrils swaying in time with the eerie resonance that was now almost deafening. The sensation was overwhelming, suffocating even, as if the planet itself were pressing in on them from every direction. Tessa's heart thudded painfully in her chest. What the hell are they doing? I think they're trying to communicate, Simon murmured, his voice tense but awestruck. We need to keep calm. This could be some kind of bonding ritual, or a defensive gesture. His words were cut off as the hum reached its peak, a high-pitched frequency that made his teeth rattle. He staggered back, gripping his ears in pain. Tessa's vision blurred as the air around them seemed to warp, like they were caught in the eye of a storm, only this was a storm of sound, a living thing. Her knees buckled as the pressure increased, the sound invading every corner of her mind. It was too much. The Kwei's movement stopped. They hung there, suspended in the air, as if waiting for something. And then, impossibly, the sound ceased. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with a kind of expectancy that made Tessa's skin prickle. I think they've stopped, Simon said hoarsely, blinking, his eyes wild from the sudden silence. Tessa rubbed her temples, trying to clear the residual ringing in her ears. She couldn't find the words. There had been something in the sound, something too alien for her to process. But the Kwei were still there, watching them, their glow pulsing softly in the quiet. Then, in an act of sheer audacity, Simon stepped forward. Hey, wait. Tessa hissed, but Simon was already moving, his eyes focused on the Kwei like a moth drawn to flame. He seemed almost mesmerized by their otherworldly beauty, the way their tendrils swayed hypnotically in the stillness. Simon, what are you doing? Get back here. Tessa shouted, but he didn't hear her. The Kwei didn't move. Instead, one of the entities, a large, central one, extended its tendrils toward Simon, and in an instant, he was surrounded. The air crackled with an invisible energy, and a strange, warm sensation surged through him, almost like a spark of electricity. His skin tingled. He couldn't pull away. The Kwei were moving around him now, but there was no hostility in their movements, no aggression. It was as if they were assessing him. Or perhaps something else entirely. Simon. Tessa's voice was shrill now, cutting through the odd stillness. Stop it. This isn't right. But Simon was too far gone. His eyes had glazed over, and he was muttering something under his breath, his words unintelligible. The Kwei were moving with him, their presence suffocating in its intensity, but not in a violent way. No, it felt curious. Tessa rushed forward, but as soon as she crossed into the radius where the Kwei floated, the air thickened. It was like wading through wet fabric. She gasped, her lungs constricting. The pressure was unbearable, like something was pushing against her chest, forcing her to the ground. She collapsed, her breath coming in short gasps. The Kwei, sensing her distress, seemed to pull back just enough to allow her to breathe, but they were still there, floating around Simon in their eerie, beautiful way. Simon, she croaked, trying to reach him, but her voice was lost in the hum that surrounded them. He was still unresponsive, his face slack, as though he had fallen into some trance. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, the Kwei retreated, floating backward into the sky with their graceful, silent movement. Simon fell to his knees, his expression dazed. The weight in the air lifted immediately, leaving Tessa gasping for air as though she had just surfaced from deep water. "Simon," she cried again, her voice now panicked. He blinked a few times, shaking his head, as if waking from a dream. When his eyes finally focused on her, they were filled with confusion. "Tessa. What happened? What did they?" "I told you to stay back," she snapped, half relieved, half angry. We could have been killed. They weren't doing anything good. You don't just walk up to aliens like that without knowing." He held up a hand, his face pale, his breath shallow. "No, Tessa, you don't understand. They showed me something. They told me something." Tessa's eyes narrowed. "What the hell are you talking about?" "They want us to stop," Simon whispered, his voice trembling. "The Kwei, they need us to stop. They're asking us to leave." Tessa felt her stomach drop. "Leave? What do you mean, leave?" Simon met her gaze, his eyes wide with a strange intensity. "The Kwei, they see us as a threat. Not just to them, but to their entire ecosystem. If we stay here, we will destroy them." A long silence passed between them, the weight of Simon's words sinking in like a stone in water. Tessa took a step back, her mind spinning. "What? No. That can't be right." Her voice was shaky, disbelief coating her words like a bitter aftertaste. "You're telling me they want us to leave? Just like that?" Simon's expression was distant, his eyes unfocused as if he were still lost in the experience. His body was there, but his mind was somewhere far away. "It's not that simple. They don't want us gone. They need us gone. If we stay, if we keep trying to colonize this planet, we'll destroy them. He shook his head, as if still processing the gravity of what had happened. "It's their breeding process. We're disrupting it." Tessa stared at him, her heart hammering in her chest. This was madness. They'd been here for months, building everything they could to make this planet a new home. They couldn't just leave because some alien jellyfish thing told them to. "Simon, this doesn't make sense," she snapped. "You're telling me that everything we've worked for, everything we've done, was just—" She cut herself off, a knot of panic tightening in her stomach. "You're not seriously considering this, are you? We're the future here, Simon. This is what we've fought for. A new home. A new start. You can't just throw that away." Simon's gaze sharpened, like he was seeing her for the first time. "I know it sounds crazy, Tessa. I didn't want to believe it either. But this planet, it's alive in ways we don't understand. The Kwei, they've been here for a long time. Maybe they've lived here for centuries, millennia. And we're like a disease to them. A virus. Our presence is poisoning their ecosystem." Tessa felt a strange chill settle over her. It wasn't just disbelief anymore. There was something about Simon's words, the way he said them, that made her stomach churn. The hum, the feeling of pressure in the air, the way the Kwei had surrounded him, everything about it felt so wrong. But she had to hold on. She had to fight this, for the colony. For everyone who had given everything to make Herzo's star their new home. "We can't just walk away, Simon," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "You don't understand." "We can't." "Yes, we can," Simon interrupted, his voice sharp now. "They are telling us to stop. I'm not imagining this. The Kwei didn't just show me something, they showed me everything. They're connected to this planet in ways we can't begin to comprehend. Their entire species, every living thing here, is part of a delicate cycle. And us, the humans, are the disruption." Tessa's chest tightened. "But this is the future, Simon. Our future. We've spent generations trying to find a new world. We're supposed to thrive here. Simon looked down at the ground, his shoulders slumping. Maybe we've misunderstood what it means to thrive. Maybe we were never meant to settle here. We came with our own sense of entitlement, our own idea of what success looks like, but we didn't understand what we were dealing with. The silence between them hung heavy. Tessa's thoughts whirled. Her mind kept returning to the image of the Kwei, those glowing, alien beings that had encircled Simon, their strange tendrils brushing against him, making him different. She'd seen it in his eyes. He'd changed, and then, almost as if summoned by her thoughts, the air trembled again. The low hum returned, not from the Kwei but from the very planet itself. The ground shuddered beneath them, a vibration that rattled through Tessa's bones, reminding her that this place wasn't just another empty world for humanity to mold. It was alive, in a way they couldn't possibly control. I don't think we're going to be able to ignore this, Simon said quietly, breaking the silence. The Kwei won't let us. If we keep pushing forward, if we refuse to listen to them, we'll destroy what's here. We'll destroy them. Tessa felt a wave of nausea rise up in her throat. She tried to push it down, to fight against the panic creeping into her veins, but the truth was starting to sink in. If what Simon said was right, if they really were standing at the precipice of destroying an entire ecosystem, an alien race, then what did that mean for humanity? Were they willing to throw away everything just to build a colony on a planet that was never meant for them? The voice in her head, the voice of reason, the voice of survival, demanded that she push Simon's words away. They couldn't just leave. They couldn't give up after everything they'd sacrificed. The Kwei didn't own this planet. The planet was for the taking, but another part of her, deep down where the truth lingered, knew that Simon was right. They hadn't just arrived on an empty world. They hadn't found a barren rock that could be reshaped into a new home. No, Herzog's star was something else entirely. It was alive. And the Kwei were its guardians. Then what do we do now? Tessa asked, her voice small, unsure. How do we fix this? Simon didn't answer immediately. He seemed lost in thought, looking out toward the horizon where the Kwei had retreated, their forms now barely visible against the shimmering sky. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. We stop. We leave. We go back to Earth. Tessa felt her stomach churn again. The very thought of retreating, of abandoning everything they had worked for, felt like a betrayal. To the mission. To humanity's future. You really think they'll let us leave? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, Simon said, turning to face her, his eyes tired. But I think if we don't try, if we keep pushing forward, we'll force their hand. And that might be something we can't come back from. Tessa stood there, her legs trembling, trying to process everything that had just happened. The weight of it all seemed too much to bear. The Kwei, the warnings, the threats of destruction, they weren't just the fantasies of a few scientists. They were real. The world beneath their feet was real. The Kwei were real. And they were telling them to stop. Come on, Simon said softly, his voice gentle now. We need to go back to the colony. We need to make a plan. A real one. Tessa didn't move immediately. She stood there, rooted in place, staring out at the empty land that had promised them everything. And now, it seemed, it was offering only one thing, a warning. Finally, with a slow, reluctant sigh, she turned and began walking back toward the shuttle. Simon followed her, his footsteps heavy on the cracked earth. They had come to Herzog's star to start anew. But now, they faced an impossible decision. Would they destroy the planet they had come to colonize, or would they turn their backs on everything they had worked for? Neither option seemed like victory. But as they made their way back to the colony, they both understood the same thing. Sometimes, survival wasn't about fighting harder. Sometimes, survival was about knowing when to stop. The colony was eerily quiet when Simon and Tessa returned. The soft hum of the generators, the usual background buzz of life support systems, seemed muffled as if the air itself was holding its breath. As they approached the central hub, the familiar sights of their home modular structures, makeshift labs, the shiny hull of the old transport shuttle felt almost foreign now, as though they had stepped into a place that no longer welcomed them. Eliza stood at the entrance of the command center, her arms crossed, her brow furrowed. The second she saw Simon and Tessa, her gaze locked onto them, searching their faces for answers. "You two look like you've seen a ghost," Eliza said, her voice dry, yet the tension in it was palpable. Tessa opened her mouth to speak, but Simon cut her off. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "About the Kwei." Eliza's expression shifted immediately, her body tensing as she stepped aside, motioning for them to enter. "We've been getting more interference on the comms. Larkin's been losing his mind with that damn probe. Are we closer to figuring out what's going on?" Tessa followed Simon into the room, the weight of what they had just learned settling over her like a dark cloud. "Closer? I don't think you're going to like what we found." Simon's eyes were dark, his voice low. "The Kwei, they're not just some indigenous species. They're part of this planet in a way we can't understand. And they're warning us. We're disturbing their breeding cycle. They want us to leave." Eliza froze. For a long moment, she didn't say anything, just stared at Simon, her face unreadable. Then, slowly, she let out a sharp breath, as if she'd been holding it in for too long. "You're saying that these things, these alien jellyfish, want us to leave? Just like that?" "It's not that simple," Tessa interjected, her voice tight. "They're connected to the planet. To everything here. We disrupt them. We destroy the balance." "Destroy?" Eliza repeated, her voice rising. "We're trying to build a future here, Simon. This is our future. What do we look like to you? Quitters? Do you really think we've come this far just to turn tail and run?" Simon's face hardened. "I'm not saying we quit, Eliza. I'm saying that if we stay here, we're going to destroy this world. And we're not just talking about the Kwei. It's the entire ecosystem. The whole damn planet. We'll ruin it." For a moment, Eliza just stared at him, disbelief and anger swirling in her eyes. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Then, with a sharp motion, she spun away, pacing across the room, her boots scraping against the metal floor. "This can't be happening," she muttered, almost to herself. Tessa took a deep breath and stepped closer. "Eliza, we're not saying we don't want to settle here. We just need to understand what's at stake. The Kwei made it clear. If we keep pushing forward, it won't end well for anyone. But we have every right to be here," Eliza snapped, rounding on them. Her face flushed with frustration. "We've been given this opportunity, earned it. We've fought for years, decades, to get this far. You think I'm just going to throw it all away because a few alien creatures don't like our presence? We cannot let them dictate our future." "We're not throwing it away," Simon said, his voice soft but firm. "We're trying to save it. It's not about them dictating anything. It's about survival. If we keep going down this path, we won't just lose this colony. We'll lose everything. The Kwei, the ecosystem, they're telling us to stop before we do something irreversible." Eliza closed her eyes, taking a slow breath, and for a moment, the room fell silent, the weight of the decision settling in like a heavy cloud. Tessa watched her, her chest tight, waiting for a response. Finally, Eliza spoke, her voice quieter, but no less intense. "You're telling me we have two choices. Either we abandon everything we've worked for, everything we've built, or we risk destroying this planet and all of its life. Is that it?" "Yeah," Tessa said softly. "That's it." Eliza's gaze softened, but only for a moment. She let out a long, frustrated sigh, then ran a hand through her hair. "I can't just walk away, Simon. I can't. Not without knowing we gave it everything we had. We need to do more." We need to know everything we're up against before we make a decision. Simon nodded. I agree. We have to know if there's a way to coexist with them. If we can't find that, if we can't, then we have no choice but to leave, Eliza finished for him. I know. Tessa's eyes darted between the two of them. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. They were all in agreement, but the choice wasn't simple. It never was. There was no clear answer. Only more questions. Let's get to work, Eliza said, her voice suddenly calm, resolute. We're not making any decisions until we understand what we're dealing with. We'll talk to the Kwei again. We'll learn everything we can. And if we can't fix this, then we'll deal with it. But I'm not walking away without knowing we gave it a real shot. Tessa could see the fire in Eliza's eyes. There would be no turning back now. We'll need more data, Simon said, his tone serious. We need to analyze the frequency the Kwei used to communicate. It wasn't just sound. It was a form of pressure, a kind of biological resonance. If we can isolate it, maybe we can understand more about their breeding cycle, their ecology. If we can understand them better, we might be able to find a way to live here. Eliza nodded. Then that's what we'll do. I'll get Larkin working on the comms. He's been obsessed with those interference patterns. Maybe we can use that to track the signals and isolate the frequency. Tessa, Simon, you're with me. We're going back to the surface. We'll make contact again, try to learn more. Tessa's stomach churned at the thought of going back out there. But she nodded. I'll gather more samples. We need to make sure we understand the local environment as much as possible before we push any further. Simon shot her a glance. We need to approach them carefully, Tessa. We don't know what will happen if we push them too far. I know, she said, her voice tight with both fear and determination. The decision had been made. The only question left was whether the Kwei would allow them to make the choice for themselves or whether the planet would make it for them. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Eliza worked with Larkin to decipher the signals that had been interfering with their communications. Simon and Tessa prepared their gear, checking samples, calibrating sensors, and making sure everything was in place for their next excursion to the surface. As the shuttle's engines hummed to life again, Tessa felt an icy knot tighten in her chest. She couldn't help but wonder if they were making a mistake. If the Kwei's warnings were something they could ignore. Or worse, if they were already too late. They lifted off from the colony's landing pad, the desolate expanse of Herzog's star stretching before them like a great, empty sea. Simon sat beside Tessa in silence, his face pale and drawn. Eliza was at the helm, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her expression unreadable. The shuttle hummed steadily through the strange atmosphere, cutting through the shimmering air toward the coordinates they'd marked earlier. The Kwei hadn't been far. And Tessa could feel it in her bones. Their presence was still out there, waiting. Watching, and deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything they did now, every move they made, might be pushing them closer to something they didn't fully understand. The shuttle cut through the atmosphere of Herzog's star, its engines humming steadily as they descended. The surface below them seemed eerily still, an endless expanse of jagged rock, rolling hills, and strange, undulating terrain. Tessa stared out the viewport, her breath shallow, her mind racing. The planet felt more alien now, more alive than it had before. Before, it had been just another world, a place for humanity to plant roots, to carve out a new future. But now, it was clear, this world didn't want them here. Simon sat across from her, his eyes distant. He hadn't said much since they'd left the colony, and the silence between them felt heavy. She could almost hear the gears turning in his mind as he processed everything: the Kwei, their warnings, the realization that humanity might be the true threat here. Tessa swallowed hard, trying to steady her nerves. There was still so much they didn't understand, so much they needed to figure out. She'd agreed to go back to the surface, but deep down, part of her wished they could just leave, take the shuttle, turn around, and head back to the relative safety of the colony. It was tempting, but she knew it wasn't an option. They had a duty now, not just to themselves, but to everyone they'd left behind on Earth. Eliza's voice crackled over the comms, breaking through the thick silence. "We're nearing the coordinates. Prepare yourselves for landing." Tessa nodded, though she wasn't sure why. There wasn't much to prepare for. Everything had changed since their first encounter with the Kwei. The planet was no longer just a barren frontier waiting to be colonized. It was a place with its own pulse, its own rules. And it didn't seem to care much for human ambitions. The shuttle settled gently onto the rocky surface, the landing gear scraping against the earth. Tessa braced herself against the seat, her heart pounding in her chest as the engines powered down. Outside, the atmosphere felt heavy, dense, as though the air itself was waiting for something. "Let's do this," Simon said quietly, unbuckling his seatbelt. He stood up, his movements slow, deliberate. Tessa followed suit, though her legs felt like lead. She wasn't sure what they would find when they stepped outside, but part of her feared it wouldn't be good. Eliza led the way out of the shuttle, the hatch hissing as it opened. The cold wind hit them immediately, carrying with it the faint scent of something sharp like ozone, like electricity. It was disorienting. The landscape around them was vast and unsettling, filled with strange, twisted rock formations and patches of dark, oily soil that seemed to pulse with an almost imperceptible rhythm. The Kwei weren't visible yet, but Tessa could feel their presence in the air. The way the wind seemed to hum, the way the atmosphere crackled with energy, it was as if the planet itself was alive, aware of them. Watching them. "Stay close," Eliza ordered, her voice steady. She checked her equipment one last time, adjusting the settings on her portable comm device. "We'll head toward the last known location of the Kwei. We'll see if we can make contact again." The three of them moved across the rocky terrain, the sound of their boots crunching on the gravel the only noise for a long stretch. Tessa kept her gaze on the ground ahead of her, though her mind kept returning to the memory of Simon, surrounded by the Kwei, the way he had looked when they had first made contact with them. There had been something almost otherworldly about it. Something that felt so wrong but also deeply fascinating. "What do you think they want from us?" Tessa asked, her voice tentative, not sure whether she was speaking to Simon or Eliza. Simon glanced over at her. "I don't think it's about wanting anything. The Kwei don't seem to think of us the way we think of them. They're not asking for anything. They're warning us." "Warning us?" Tessa frowned. "What does that even mean?" He hesitated. I think they've been living on this planet for a long time. Longer than we could ever imagine. And we're a disruption. Everything about us, our technology, our bodies, our way of being, is messing with their system. Their reproductive cycle. Their whole way of life." Tessa's mind reeled at the implications. She couldn't deny that there was something in Simon's words that felt true. They hadn't just come to a new world. They had come to a world that was already alive in ways they didn't understand. "We still don't know what they are, though," Eliza cut in, her voice sharp. "We don't know their biology. Their society. Their whatever it is that holds them together. We need more data, Simon. We need to know what we're dealing with before we make any kind of decision." "I agree," Simon said. "We need to find a way to communicate with them. The signals, they were too much for us to understand, but I think there's something there. A pattern. We need to find out what it is before Simon could finish." The ground trembled. A deep, rhythmic pulse resonated from the earth beneath their feet, a vibration that rattled the air and sent shivers down Tessa's spine. It wasn't the kind of tremor they had felt when they first arrived on Herzog's star, but something more controlled. More deliberate. Something the planet itself seemed to be doing on purpose. Eliza immediately stopped, her hand raised in a motion for them to stay silent. What the hell was that? Tessa didn't need to answer. The Kwei were near. She could feel them in the air, their presence like a weight pressing against her chest, subtle but undeniable. The rhythmic pulse seemed to be growing louder, vibrating through the soil beneath them, through the air itself, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pulse stopped, the wind shifted, and from the shadows of the distant rock formations, the Kwei appeared. They didn't move the way she had expected them to. They didn't float or drift lazily through the air as they had before. This time, they moved in a slow, purposeful manner, their bodies shimmering in the light of Herzog's star's twin suns, their tendrils extending outward like the limbs of some immense, ghostly creature. Tessa's breath caught in her throat. There were more of them this time, more than she had ever seen. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of Kwei moving in unison, their iridescent forms weaving through the air like some great, living cloud. They surrounded them. Tessa didn't know what to do. Her heart raced, and she felt the pressure of the Kwei's presence in her chest, as though they were speaking without words. The air itself hummed, vibrating in a strange, almost tangible way, and then, for the first time, the Kwei spoke, not in a language, but through a series of resonant frequencies, a strange series of tones and pulses that seemed to reach inside her, stirring something deep within her mind. She felt it not in her ears, but in her very bones. The message wasn't something that could be heard, but something that could be felt. The Kwei's message was clear, leave, but as the word echoed in her mind, another feeling came, something darker, something far more pressing. You don't belong here. Tessa's breath caught. She could almost feel their thoughts, their warning, their fear. And yet there was something else, something in the way they moved, in the way they surrounded them. A deeper message: you don't belong here. Yet. Tessa's heart hammered in her chest. The Kwei were everywhere now, their translucent bodies swirling around them, a ghostly, shimmering presence in the dim light. The pulsing hum in the air had grown deeper, resonating within her chest as though the planet itself was speaking to her through these strange creatures. The message was clear, yet unsettling: you don't belong here. Yet, she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The pulse of sound, their communication, seemed to block out everything else, filling her mind with a thick, metallic resonance that made her head ache. She reached up, trying to steady herself, her legs wobbling beneath her. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, the entire landscape vibrating in tune with the Kwei's song. It was as if the very earth was alive with them, a living, breathing organism. Simon stood motionless beside her, his eyes wide, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He was just as affected by the resonance, but there was something else there too, something in his expression that Tessa couldn't place. He seemed connected. As if the Kwei had found a way to draw him in more deeply than the rest of them. Eliza, however, had no patience for whatever this was. Her hand tightened around the rifle slung across her back, and she took a step forward, her boots crunching against the rocky ground. "We're not leaving," she said, her voice cutting through the hum like a blade. "Not without answers. What do you want from us? What do you mean by that?" For a long moment, there was only silence, the pulsing hum fading into a faint, steady thrum that seemed to reverberate through the air. Then, slowly, one of the Kwei, the largest, its body nearly the size of the shuttle, drifted forward, its tendrils reaching toward them with deliberate slowness. Tessa instinctively stepped back, her breath caught in her throat. The thing was massive, its iridescent skin rippling in the light, shifting like liquid as it moved closer. But despite its immense size, there was a strange, fluid grace to its movements, as though it wasn't truly bound by the laws of physics. The creature paused just a few feet in front of them, its tendrils curling like fingers, its translucent body gleaming like a liquid pearl. Tessa could feel its presence in her mind, more pronounced now than ever before. The air around her seemed to grow thicker, the resonance nearly unbearable. It felt like the Kwei were trying to force something into her head, something she couldn't understand, something beyond words. And then, just as she thought she might lose herself to the pressure of the resonant frequencies, a thought broke through her mind. It was clear, sharp, not a voice, but a pulse of intent that cut through the confusion. "Your presence here is a disturbance." The words were not spoken, not in any human sense, but somehow Tessa knew. She could feel it in the way the air itself vibrated, in the strange pressure building within her skull. "You disrupt the balance." The message stopped, cut off abruptly. The Kwei swirled in the air around them, retreating slightly, as if they had reached a limit in what they could communicate, as though whatever force was controlling their interaction with the humans had been temporarily disrupted. Tessa glanced at Simon, who was still staring, wide-eyed, at the Kwei, his mouth slightly open. It was clear that he, too, had felt the intensity of the message. Eliza, meanwhile, was ready for action. She gritted her teeth, scanning the Kwei for any signs of aggression. "What the hell is this?" she muttered under her breath, her hand inching toward the comm device clipped to her belt. Simon stepped forward, breaking the silence. "They're not threatening us, Eliza," he said, his voice strangely calm. They're trying to communicate. There's something deeper here, something more than just warnings." Tessa wasn't sure she understood what Simon meant, but she could feel the weight of his words. Whatever the Kwei were trying to say, it wasn't just about keeping them off the planet. It was about something more fundamental. Something about how humanity were disrupting the natural order of things. One of the Kwei, the one that had been closest to them, drifted forward once more, this time much closer. Its tendrils brushed against the air around them, creating soft ripples in the atmosphere as though it were gently probing their presence. Tessa could feel the pressure building again, a faint buzzing in her skull. The creature seemed to be assessing them, studying them, and then, just as quickly as it had moved, the Kwei recoiled, its form shimmering. For a second, everything seemed to freeze. The hum in the air stopped. The ground beneath their feet grew still. And then the message came again. But this time, it wasn't a command. It wasn't a warning. It was an invitation: return to the origin. Learn. Understand. Then you may choose. Tessa blinked, her heart pounding. Return to the origin? What did that even mean? The creature before her pulsed once more, and she felt the resonant frequency shift. It wasn't like before. There was no pressure. No painful force pushing into her mind. This time, it felt softer. More deliberate. As if they were being offered something, rather than warned. Simon spoke first, his voice hesitant. The origin. They want us to go back to where they first encountered us. To understand them. Eliza narrowed her eyes. And you think we should do that? I think we don't have a choice, Simon replied softly. They've made it clear. We can either leave or we can learn. If we don't take this chance to understand what they're trying to tell us, then we're just guessing. Tessa finished for him. She swallowed hard. The decision was hanging in the air now, and it felt like the Kwei were waiting for them to choose. Eliza took a long, slow breath, clearly weighing her options. Her gaze flicked between Simon and Tessa, her fingers twitching as though she were about to reach for her weapon again. I don't like it. I don't like feeling like we're being pushed into something we don't understand. We don't have a choice, Simon said again, his voice firm now. We've already disturbed them. We're too far into this to turn back. We need to understand them. If we can. Eliza was quiet for a moment, her gaze moving between the Kwei and the horizon. Finally, she sighed. Fine. Let's find out what the hell they mean. But if things go south, we're leaving. No more chances. The Kwei hovered around them, undisturbed by their conversation. Their iridescent bodies shimmered in the dim light, a silent, watching presence. Tessa could feel their eyes on her, or at least, feel their presence, like a weight pressing against her consciousness. Let's go, Eliza said, setting her shoulders. We're not going to figure this out standing here. With that, they began to move again, this time with a more cautious purpose. The Kwei remained with them, trailing just behind, their bodies shifting with the strange rhythm of the world around them. Every step Tessa took felt heavy, like the air was closing in on them. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was it, this was the point of no return. Whatever the Kwei wanted from them, whatever they were going to learn, would change everything. The planet was no longer a blank slate. It was alive, and its inhabitants were watching. Waiting, and Tessa had no idea what would happen if they couldn't understand what the Kwei were trying to say. The Kwei followed them, their bodies weaving like smoke through the air. Tessa could feel them around her, their presence nearly tangible, a constant hum in the atmosphere that made her skin crawl. The invitation to return to the origin echoed in her mind, but she still had no idea what it meant. What could the Kwei possibly want her to understand? What was their origin? How could they humans ever hope to grasp whatever ancient knowledge they were being asked to uncover? Her thoughts were a tangled mess, but as they moved deeper into the barren landscape, the world around them began to shift. The ground here was softer, the rock formations more jagged, twisting in strange, unnatural shapes. The air felt warmer too, heavier, as though they were moving toward something central, something significant. Tessa's eyes darted over the strange terrain, her senses on high alert. She could hear nothing but the soft crunch of their boots on the uneven ground and the rhythmic hum of the Kwei in the air. Simon, ever the quiet one, didn't speak. He seemed to be concentrating, his brow furrowed, his eyes scanning the environment with a kind of intensity that made Tessa uneasy. It was as if he were listening to something she couldn't hear, attuned to some signal, some subtle vibration in the world around them. Eliza, however, had no patience for the silence. "You're not seriously considering going back to wherever the Kwei are leading us, are you?" she said, her voice low, but laced with a sharpness that made Tessa wince. Simon didn't look at her, but his tone was calm, almost soothing. "We don't have a choice, Eliza. They've made it clear. If we don't go with them, if we don't try to understand them, we're just going to keep pushing them away. And if we keep pushing them away, they'll kill us," Eliza finished, her words bitter. "Yeah, I get it. But that doesn't mean I'm okay with it. This whole thing feels off. Like we're walking straight into something we don't understand. And I don't know about you, but I've had enough of that." Tessa looked at Simon, then at Eliza. She could feel the tension between them, the chasm of disagreement widening with every word. But she also knew that neither of them had the answers. They were walking blind into something far bigger than any of them, and whatever lay ahead was likely beyond their comprehension. "There's no other way," Tessa said, breaking the silence. Her voice was steadier than she felt, but she didn't care. She needed to say it. "We have to find out what they're trying to tell us. We can't just keep avoiding it. If they're offering us a chance to learn, to understand why they're doing this, then we have to take it." Eliza shot her a sidelong glance, but said nothing. She was clearly uncomfortable with the idea, but she knew Tessa was right. There was no turning back now. They continued on, moving deeper into the alien landscape, the Kwei following just behind them, their movements fluid and silent. As they rounded a large rock outcrop, Tessa's heart skipped a beat. Ahead of them was a vast open space, a kind of natural amphitheater carved out by eons of erosion, and in the center of it, something was waiting. A structure that was unlike anything Tessa had ever seen before. It wasn't built by human hands, that was clear. It wasn't even like anything she had seen in the alien architecture back on the colony. The shape was fluid, organic, as if it had grown from the very earth itself. Its surface was dark and smooth, shimmering with an iridescent quality that reflected the twin suns above. The structure seemed to pulse, subtly, as though it was alive. Tessa's breath caught in her throat. This was it. This was the origin. The Kwei had stopped moving, hovering just outside the perimeter of the structure, their bodies still. The silence was suffocating now, oppressive. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Eliza took a step forward, her voice barely a whisper. This is what they wanted us to find?" "I think so," Simon said, his voice distant as he stared at the structure. He looked almost entranced. "This isn't just some alien ruin. It's connected. It's not dead. It's alive." Tessa didn't respond. Her mind raced, trying to piece together what Simon had said. If this place was alive, then was it somehow aware of them? Were they walking into a living, breathing entity? And if so, What was its purpose? She took a hesitant step toward the structure, the Kwei's presence pressing down on her like a physical force. She felt the pull of it, as though the very air was coaxing her forward. And yet, at the same time, a deep, primal instinct screamed for her to turn back, but there was no going back now. The Kwei, their movements as fluid as ever, slowly began to encircle the structure, their tendrils trailing over its surface, as though they were communicating with it. As they did, Tessa saw something faint at first, like a shadow, but then clearer an opening began to appear in the side of the structure. It wasn't a door, at least not in the traditional sense. It was more like a tear in the fabric of reality itself. A dark, rippling portal that pulsed with energy, the edges shimmering as though the very fabric of space was bending and warping. Simon moved first. His steps were slow, almost reverent, as though he were walking toward something sacred, something that demanded respect. Tessa hesitated for a moment longer, but then followed, her feet moving of their own accord, her curiosity overpowering her fear. They were inside the portal before she could even process it. The world around her twisted and distorted, her vision blurring for a moment as if they were traveling through a thick fog. The air around her crackled with static, the hum of the Kwei vibrating through her bones. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the disorientation stopped. They were in another place. Tessa's breath caught in her throat. They were standing in a vast, cavernous space, the size of a stadium. The walls, if they could even be called walls, were alive, shifting and pulsing, as if the structure itself were a living organism, breathing, thinking. The floor beneath their feet was soft and spongy, like a thick carpet of moss, but it seemed to have a pulse of its own, beating in time with the Kwei's hum. In the center of the room was something else, something far more strange and unsettling than anything Tessa had imagined. It was a creature, but not like any creature she had ever seen. Its form was vast, almost impossible to comprehend. It was as though it were made of the same shimmering material as the Kwei, but on a scale that defied description. Its shape seemed to shift, to flow, as though it were a being of pure energy, but at the same time, it seemed solid, its surface rippling like liquid metal. Tendrils of energy stretched from its center, reaching out and disappearing into the walls, as though it were connected to everything in this space. The Kwei were already gathered around it, their bodies floating in an almost ceremonial manner, their tendrils reaching out to touch the creature, as though they were absorbing something from it. Tessa felt a wave of awe and terror wash over her. This was it. This was the origin. This was the place where it all began, the source of the Kwei's strange, otherworldly power. The thing at the center of the room, it was the origin, and it was watching them. The creature didn't have eyes. But Tessa felt its gaze nonetheless. The energy around her thickened, pressing down on her like a heavy weight. The message from the Kwei echoed in her mind again: learn. Understand. Then you may choose. Tessa's hands trembled as she reached out, her fingers brushing the air in front of her. The space seemed to bend in response, as if it were waiting for her to make the next move. She wasn't sure what would happen next. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to understand or learn. But she knew, without a doubt, that whatever it was, it would change everything. The creature's presence in the center of the vast chamber filled the air with a palpable, suffocating weight. Tessa could feel her pulse quicken as the realization settled in. This thing wasn't just part of the Kwei's world. It was the world. The entire ecosystem, perhaps even the planet itself, seemed to be intricately connected to this one entity. Everything here, everything the Kwei had shown them, was tied to this living, breathing mass of energy. It was as if the creature existed beyond time and space, its form flickering in and out of existence, and yet, in some way, it was now. The Kwei around them seemed to move with purpose, their bodies pulsing in rhythm with the shifting energy in the room. Their tendrils reached out, touching the air, the walls, and even the creature itself, as though they were feeding off its presence, communing with it. Tessa could feel the hum vibrating through her chest, resonating in a way that almost felt too intimate, too direct, like an invasive thought slipping into her mind without permission. She stepped forward, her feet moving on their own, though her mind screamed at her to stop. The creature, or whatever it was, seemed to pull her in, beckoning with an invisible force. It was almost as if it had noticed her, had sensed her, and now it was waiting for her to make the next move. Behind her, Simon stood motionless, his hand gripping his side. He was staring at the creature, his expression unreadable. But Tessa could see something in his eyes, and now a flicker of recognition, or perhaps understanding. She couldn't be sure, but whatever it was, it unnerved her. Simon was never the one to be the first to understand, the first to make a decision. And yet now, it seemed, he was already too far gone in whatever mental space the creature had pulled them into. Eliza, on the other hand, was practically vibrating with tension. Her hand was resting on the hilt of her weapon, though she made no move to draw it. She was alert, every muscle tensed, ready for anything. The silence between them was deafening, broken only by the faint whir of energy in the air. It was clear that Eliza wasn't ready to trust this place, or whatever this creature was. She was waiting for something, an answer, a signal, something that would tell her it was time to act. Tessa wasn't sure what she was waiting for. The Kwei, despite their constant presence, hadn't said anything else. The only sounds were their strange, resonating hums, reverberating through the vast chamber. The walls around them continued to pulse, an organic rhythm that seemed to synchronize with her heartbeat. The creature at the center of the room shimmered, its form expanding and contracting like it was breathing or perhaps thinking. Then, in a sudden, almost imperceptible shift, the creature's surface rippled, and a burst of energy shot outward, sending a shockwave through the air. Tessa staggered back, almost losing her balance, but she was caught by Simon, who steadied her with a hand on her shoulder. Eliza whipped her head around, her eyes wild with instinctual fear. The energy wasn't violent, but it was powerful, a concentrated pulse that felt like it had hit her directly in the chest. Tessa blinked, trying to clear her head. The air was thick with electricity, the hum of the Kwei louder now, as though they were singing in unison with the pulse of the creature. It wasn't a physical pain, but the sensation of being inside something, the feeling of being submerged in a vast ocean where everything had a weight and a force all its own. The pressure on her mind intensified, as though something was pushing into her consciousness, and then, suddenly, she understood, not with words, not with thoughts, but with a deep, primal sense of knowing. This creature was not just alive. It was aware. It was aware of her, of them, of everything. The entire planet was interconnected, and the Kwei were the agents of its will. The pulse of energy she just felt was a signal, an invitation. They had been called here for a reason, a purpose far larger than they could comprehend. Tessa felt a strange sense of calm flood over her as the realization washed through her. This was not a place of violence, not a place of fear, it was a place of understanding. The Kwei were not hostile. They were protectors, guardians of the balance that kept the planet's life force intact. They weren't trying to eliminate humanity, they were trying to make them see. To make them understand what had been disrupted when they had come to this planet. The colony, their expansion, their technology, it was all out of sync with the natural order of this world. The question now was, could they fix it? Could they choose to return to balance, or would humanity's intrusion be the catalyst that destroyed everything? Tessa looked at Simon, whose eyes were wide with understanding. He was already processing the same revelation she had just experienced. He didn't need to say anything. His expression told her everything she needed to know, but Eliza was still holding back, her hand tightening on the weapon at her side, her body coiled with tension. She didn't understand what Tessa had just realized, not yet. And Tessa couldn't blame her. The sheer weight of the truth was overwhelming. They weren't just standing at the edge of a new world. They were standing at the precipice of a decision that could alter the course of human history. Another pulse rippled through the chamber, this time slower, almost deliberate. The Kwei, still floating in the air, stretched out their tendrils toward the creature, as if offering their guidance. The energy in the room thickened, and Tessa felt it again, the pull. She had to go closer. She had to understand more. With a deep breath, she stepped forward, her feet almost moving of their own accord. She was drawn to the creature, drawn to its shimmering, fluid surface. As she moved closer, the air around her grew warmer, and the hum of the Kwei intensified, filling her chest, her head, her very being. It was like the planet itself was speaking to her, sharing its memories, its wisdom. She reached out a hand, and as her fingers touched the surface of the creature, something shifted. The world around her cracked open. A rush of images too many to process, too fast to understand, flooded her mind. She saw the Kwei, not as they were now, but in their distant past, the first moments of their arrival on this planet, their communion with the life force that powered everything. She saw the world before human interference, a pristine ecosystem balanced and thriving. The Kwei were not invaders, they were protectors, their very existence tied to the life cycle of this planet. They had kept it balanced for eons. And then the humans had arrived, disrupting the natural harmony. The origin had been disturbed, and now the planet was sick. Slowly, painfully, it was withering, its once perfect balance crumbling beneath the weight of humanity's unchecked expansion. The Kwei had tried to warn them, tried to reach out, but their messages had gone unheard. Now, the very essence of life here was in jeopardy, and the Kwei could not restore it alone. The choice was not just humanity's, it was the planet's. Either the balance would be restored, or the world would collapse in on itself. Tessa's heart raced. She was here, in the heart of the origin, with the power to change everything. She pulled her hand away, gasping for breath, her head spinning. The room around her had returned to stillness. The creature was silent, its surface calm once more. But Tessa knew what she had to do now. She understood what needed to happen. The Kwei were waiting for them to decide. They were offering them a chance to help restore the balance, to help the planet heal. But there was no guarantee that humanity would accept. There was no guarantee that the colony, or anyone back home, would be willing to make the sacrifices necessary to fix what had been broken. Tessa turned to Eliza and Simon. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but it was steady enough. We have to make a choice. The weight of Tessa's words hung in the air like smoke. The hum of the Kwei around them was quiet now, but it pulsed in the background, like the breath of a living being. The creature at the center, still rippling with energy, seemed to watch them all, its silent presence more oppressive than ever. Tessa's chest felt tight, the words from the creature's energy still echoing in her mind: learn. Understand. Then you may choose. She had learned. She had understood. But their choice remained. Eliza's gaze was fixed, unwavering. Her hand had shifted slightly away from the weapon at her side, but her body still screamed tension. She was no longer on edge in the way she had been before, but that didn't mean she was ready to accept what was happening. Her eyes flicked between Tessa and Simon, searching for some sign of direction, something that would make sense of this madness. Simon's face was pale, his eyes wide, but there was no fear in him now. There was something else: acceptance, perhaps even resolve. He had seen what she had seen. He knew what the Kwei wanted, what the planet itself demanded. And yet, there was something else in his expression, a question, unspoken but present, like a silent plea for guidance. A plea for Tessa to give the answer, to make the decision. The silence between them stretched on, heavy and thick, broken only by the faint hum of the Kwei, the barely perceptible sound of the creature's energy pulsing in the background. Tessa could feel their presence like a constant pressure in the air, their anticipation adding to the weight pressing down on her chest. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The choice seemed simple, in theory. The Kwei were offering them a chance to restore balance. A chance to fix the broken ecosystem, to return the planet to its natural state. All they had to do was listen, understand, and help, but the reality of it was far more complicated. The colony was not just a group of people, it was a reflection of everything humanity had worked for, everything they had built, everything they had believed in. The decision to abandon it, to change it, was not just a matter of survival. It was a matter of sacrifice, of accepting that what they had done had been wrong. That they were not the masters of this world, but guests who had overstayed their welcome, who had disrupted something far more delicate than they had ever realized. Eliza's voice broke through the silence, low and almost a growl. You can't be serious, Tessa. You're telling me we should just let this planet decide our future? Let the Kwei dictate our lives? Tessa flinched, but she didn't back down. I'm not saying that. I'm saying we have to face the truth. The Kwei are here, and they have been here long before us. They've been trying to warn us, trying to help us understand. The colony, everything we've done, it's all part of the problem. We can't keep going the way we have been. We've already seen the damage we've caused. If we don't fix it, if we don't help the Kwei, this planet won't survive. And you really believe they'll help us? Eliza shot back. You believe they won't just use us? Manipulate us? We don't even know what they want from us. Tessa's eyes locked with Eliza's. She could feel the anger, the fear, the resistance in her words, but she couldn't let that stop her. I think they want the same thing we want. To survive. To thrive. But they're telling us that it's not about us anymore. It's about the planet. It's about restoring balance. We can't have one without the other. And that means we have to make a choice. Eliza didn't answer right away, and for a moment, Tessa thought she might push her away, might argue more fiercely. But then Eliza's shoulders slumped just a little, the weight of the decision sinking in. And if we don't? If we don't make the choice they want? Tessa's voice dropped to a whisper, her throat tight. Then we lose everything. The Kwei are part of this ecosystem. Without them, the planet dies. And with it, we do too. Simon stepped forward then, his voice quiet but firm. Eliza's right to question. We don't know everything yet. We don't know what happens if we help them. If we agree to their terms, if we change everything, there's no going back. But we also don't know what happens if we refuse. We've seen what the Kwei are capable of, what happens if they're angry. Tessa nodded. The fear was there, creeping in the back of her mind, too. But the truth was, they had already crossed the point of no return. They had already seen the Kwei's power. They had already felt the planet's pulse. There was no pretending that they weren't deeply connected to the very core of this world. If they walked away from this, if they chose not to help, it wouldn't just be a choice against the Kwei. It would be a choice against the planet itself. We're already part of it, Tessa said softly, more to herself than anyone else. There's no going back. But maybe we can still fix this. If we try. Eliza's hand finally fell from the hilt of her weapon. She didn't look at Tessa, but her stance had softened. And what do we tell them? The rest of the colony? The people who will never understand? We tell them the truth, Tessa said, her voice stronger now. That we're part of something bigger than ourselves. That we made a mistake, but it's not too late to fix it. If they don't listen, then we make them. We fight for this planet, for the Kwei. We show them what it means to live in harmony with the world. Simon's voice was barely audible, but the conviction in it made Tessa's heart beat a little faster. You're right. It's not about us anymore. It's about the planet. About life here. We can't just take what we want and leave destruction in our wake. A soft shudder passed through Tessa's body, and she turned toward the creature at the center of the room. Its energy was still rippling, alive, waiting. She could feel its pull again, a gentle, insistent force tugging at her. The Kwei were watching them, their shape softening, the tendrils reaching outward once again, as if awaiting a response. That it was time. Tessa stepped forward, her breath slow and steady as she reached out, her hand brushing against the surface of the creature. This time, there was no rush of images, no flood of foreign knowledge. Instead, she felt a quiet acceptance. The energy from the creature seemed to wrap around her, like a warm embrace, as if it recognized her decision, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. She turned back to Simon and Eliza, her voice unwavering. We'll do it. We'll help the Kwei. We'll help this planet. Eliza nodded slowly, though the tension still lingered in her eyes. "And if it all goes to hell?" "We don't know that yet," Tessa said firmly. "But we have to try." Simon stepped up beside her, and together they faced the creature at the heart of this strange, alien world. Tessa felt the pull of it, the pull to make the right choice, to make it count. The hum of the Kwei filled the air again, and this time, it didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a beginning. As the creature shifted, its energy enveloping them all, Tessa knew that whatever came next would be unlike anything they had ever known. They were no longer just explorers or colonists. They were part of something much larger now. And the future of this planet and perhaps their own survival depended on the decision they had just made. The planet was waiting. The Kwei were waiting. And now, they would see what humanity was truly made of. And